Hello, everyone. So today we'll be talking about different definitions of disability, and we'll take some time to consider whether the term disability is appropriate when we're considering the full range of human ability. So we'll first discuss the medical definition of disability, which was the original definition. Then we'll discuss the context-dependent definition, which is more widely used today. And then finally, we'll consider a different definition that considers the range of human abilities rather than just disability. So what is disability? What does the term disability really even mean? One way to define disability is to take a very medicalized approach. So disability, as defined by the CDC, is any condition of the body or mind that makes it more difficult for the person with the condition to do certain activities and interact with the world around them. In the US, there are currently 61 million adults living with a disability. That's roughly 26% or 1 in 4 adults in the US alone. I've added some other demographics on this slide as well, just so that you can see kind of the intersectionality of different identities that correspond with disability. For example, 2 in 5 non-Hispanic American Indians or Alaskan Natives have a disability. So bottom line with this slide is that I want to demonstrate there are a lot of people who identify as living with a disability. And these are just statistics based on the US alone. This isn't even based on the whole world's population. So I'd also like to point out that these statistics are from the CDC, which reports on those who have a medically diagnosed disability. So one helpful way to think and categorize different types of disabilities is by differences in functioning. This could be cognitive, sensory, or physical functioning. And each of these functional impairments can vary in severity between mild, moderate, and severe impairments. So for instance, someone could have a mild cognitive impairment or a severe physical impairment. And again, this falls more into the CDC's more medicalized definition of disability. Another way to define disability is the context-dependent definition, where it's important to consider the role of the larger society in defining what a disability is. So according to the World Health Organization, disability is not just a health problem. It's a complex phenomenon reflecting the interaction between features of a person's body and features of the society in which they live. So really what I'm getting at here is that disability within the context definition is not simply a personal health problem. Disability happens at the points of interaction between a person and the world, where what the person is trying to accomplish is not supported by the environment around them. One helpful way to identify different environmental factors that lead to disability is to think about the duration of time someone has a disability. So this could be permanent, temporary, or situational. For example, permanent disabilities can include someone who lost an arm, someone who's blind, someone who's deaf or nonverbal. Disabilities can also be temporary though, such as someone who breaks their arm and is in a sling, or someone who has cataracts or an ear infection or even laryngitis. And then finally, disabilities can be situational. For example, if you're holding a baby in one arm, that arm is immobilized. In the case of distracted driving, you may be looking at your phone and in that situation, be driving as if you're blind. Or when you're at a bar or the music is playing really loud or a concert or something, you may be situationally hearing impaired. So technologies often perpetuate these mismatches in human interactions, creating what we call points of exclusion. And so by identifying these points of exclusion, we can then generate new ideas and solutions to further inclusion. So one helpful way to identify who is being excluded is to think about ability bias. So an ability bias, according to Kat Holmes, is the tendency to solve problems while using our own abilities as the baseline. When we do this, our solutions end up working well for people with similar abilities and circumstances, but can exclude a much wider group of people. So can anyone think of any examples of designs with ability bias that you've come across in your daily life? Here, I'd pause for audience feedback. So one example of this kind of ability bias that I wanted to bring up was the typical gaming console controller. So here you can see that pretty much almost all of these, you need to have two hands with lots of dexterity to be able to use these remote controllers. So this is excluding anybody that has any kind of situational or temporary or even permanent mobility constraints. Okay, so far what we've discussed has been focused on physical and sensory differences that people can have. But for this class, we're focusing on designing for those with cognitive differences. So according to the US 2010 census, 15.2 million adults, that's roughly 6.3%, experience functional difficulties due to cognitive, mental, or emotional disabilities. So this is one reason why it's so important that we design technologies for use by people of all ability levels, because if we don't, we're potentially excluding 15 million people in the US alone just who have cognitive differences. Here we're going to take a moment to pause and address a very important tension in disability discourse concerning people with cognitive differences. So I wanted to ask, and this is a question I want you to think about, not necessarily respond to, but do you think it's appropriate to talk about cognitive differences using the medicalized definition of disability? So here, I really want you to think about what we've said, and on this slide, I provide the definition for medicalized disability, but just think through, what do you believe here? I'm going to provide some arguments for yes and no, if it's appropriate. So first, some people argue that in order to understand the ability of people with cognitive differences, it's best to use this medicalized definition of disability because it uses functional terms to categorize these changes. And these terms often refer to the missing or lack of abilities of people with cognitive differences. And the argument for using these terms and the just general medicalized definition of disability is that if we don't address challenges that people have head on, then how could we make technologies inclusive to those users? However, others have argued that describing people with cognitive differences with this medicalized terms of disability and using functional difficulty languages really positions these individuals as lacking or being at a deficit, which can be really harmful for people. So, for example, think of children with dyslexia. Okay, if you're using, if they're learning how to speak, right, and they're learning that they have dyslexia, how you communicate what dyslexia is can have a really negative or positive impact on how they see their own intelligence for the rest of their lives. So it's really important how we speak about it because our words have large impact on how people view themselves. Okay, so another question I wanted to pose, is it appropriate to talk about cognitive differences using the context-dependent definition of disability? So again, I added this definition to the bottom of this slide, and no one needs to answer. It's more just a thinking about this and what do you believe? And just to tell you some of my thoughts, I really think this context-dependent definition of disability is doing less harm than the more medicalized definition. But I still think this is positioning the person with cognitive differences as in a deficit. But the blame for the deficit is not on the person like it is with the medicalized definition, but more so the deficit is the fault of larger society, but still using this deficit language. So this is where I'm proposing the term and framing of neurodiversity, and this is where I think it's the most helpful. So neurodiversity refers to the range of differences in individuals' brain function and behavioral traits. So this term was first coined by people on the autism spectrum, but it can be applied broadly to people who have intellectual and developmental disabilities, as well as people who have neurological disorders that can cause acquired cognitive impairments. So the framing of neurodiversity really just helps us to realize the range of human abilities that people bring to the table. It's also useful to see differences instead of deficits because to frame any of these cognitive differences of neurodiverse people as deficits is just not always accurate. So, for example, people with dyslexia have been found to possess really higher levels of global visuospatial abilities. So what that means is just the ability to mentally manipulate 2D or 3D figures or process low definition or blurred visuals, even perceiving peripheral images. They just do that more quickly than people without dyslexia. And this kind of gifting is really advantageous in jobs that require any kind of like 3D thinking, such as engineering or molecular biology or computer graphics. And then people with autism spectrum disorder often have strengths related to working with systems and are often better than people without autism spectrum disorder at identifying any kind of details in complex patterns like the image you see on this slide. So for this reason, lots of technology companies have been aggressively recruiting people on the autism spectrum for occupations that involve any kind of like systems thinking or computer coding, managing databases, anything like that. And then researchers have also observed that people with ADHD or bipolar disorders display greater levels of novelty seeking and creativity than people without. So often people with ADHD are very divergent thinkers is the term they use, meaning they're really good at taking a task and thinking outside of the box and asking questions that others wouldn't ask. So people with ADHD are often less cautious and are okay with taking greater risks, which some people may perceive as a negative thing, but actually, I think that's actually a good thing because no risk, no reward. So this can actually serve people really well. And then finally, people with ADHD often have difficulty filtering what they say, which can make for really great comedians. Like, for example, in this slide, there's a GIF of Jim Carrey because he is a person with ADHD. Okay, so hopefully the point of the last three slides was just to give you a more holistic view of who neurodivergent individuals are instead of just this deficit perspective that we often think. So for the rest of this class, we'll be focused on cognitive accessibility, which means that neurodiverse people can do what they need to do in a similar amount of time and effort as someone that is more neurotypical. Okay, so in summary, what have we gone over? We have different definitions of disability. The medicalized definition that focuses on functional deficits and severity of impairments. And then we have the contextual definition, which focuses on the duration of a disability and contributing environmental factors or societal factors. And then the definition that I hope to anchor on in this class, which is different than disability, is neurodiversity and focusing on the differences in abilities, but not framing individuals with cognitive differences as in any sort of deficit. So thank you for listening and excited for this course.